So when we're looking at array lists, one thing we've kind of glossed over so far is why is the notation like this? Why do we have the angle brackets? And so the first thing we need to understand is that inside the angle brackets, what we're doing is we're specifying what kind of object is held in an array list. And so objects are things like strings. We've used made integer objects before. We've invented our own objects like the rover, and we made a game, right? So these are all objects, and these are all valid things that could go into an array list. Let's contrast that with primitive types like int and double and boolean, are the ones we've probably used the most, right? And these are primitive types, and you cannot put these directly into an array list. And hopefully we've seen by now one way to quickly recognize what's going on is the objects begin with capital letters and primitive types begin with lowercase letters. All right, so that's lesson number one, is that only objects can go into array lists. Right, so now let's go ahead and take a look at this and well, what if we didn't put this here? What's going to happen? Let me get rid of this one. And already I'm getting some warnings on my code, but we can ignore that for now. And you'll see, that this line is where I'm actually getting the error. All right, so it says for string str in items, and it says type mismatch can't convert element object to string. So what happened is there is some implicit code that took place up here, and the kind of thing that got put into the array list, when you don't specify, what you end up getting is an array list of generic objects. And so when we have generic objects, right, this is what we've made here. And so let's and so when we try to make this loop, it's going, well, for string str in items, I said, well, items is not necessarily full of strings. It's full of objects. Even though strings are the only things we put in it, right, the compiler doesn't know that that necessarily nothing that is not a string will ever get put in there. So we could change this, and I could say object. I'll just change this variable name to be clear about what it is. We'll go obj, right? And change that to obj. Okay, and now all of a sudden my code should run again. Okay, and it works as expected. Now that we're putting objects in here, something else that we can do is like, well, wait a minute, can we mix and match? And we sure can, because now I'm going to put in my strings, and I'm going to put in a rover object with it, and we'll loop through it, and we'll print them all out. And everything printed as expected. Now, what's happening right here is when you print a string, we know what we're going to get. We're going to actually see the string. And when we print an object, we're getting whatever the generic toString for the object returns. And in this case, it's going to return it's going to return like the hash code of the object as a hex string. So not particularly useful, but that, at least it's printable, right? So all objects do have toString methods. But let's suppose we wanted to do something string-like with our object. Okay, and let me take this out. So now I have a list of items that only contain strings again. And let's say I wanted to print out their lengths. Okay, you can see here I'm getting an error because this array list is full of objects. And if we went to the object class and look through the methods, you can see that there's nothing in here that tells us the length of it, right? The length The length function is in the string class. It's in here somewhere. Yeah, there. So there's the length. All right. So when we look at the error here, it says length is undefined for type. Right? Length is undefined for type object, so we can't do that. Now, I suppose we could do something like if we could do some casting. So I could say if obj, and you don't have to, this is not code to memorize, I'm just demonstrating. We can check to see if the object happens to be a string, and then we could do something like string str equals string object, and we'll close that out. And then let's do str. Okay, and this code now all of a sudden will compile because we are checking before we try to call a string method on whatever item is in the list. We are first off checking number one to make sure it is in fact a string, and then we have to cast that object to a string before we before we call any string methods on it. And so this should run just fine. And there we go. And now we got the length of each string in there. And I could even put the rover back in. Okay, and we checked. We didn't try to print the rovers don't have a length, and we didn't try to do the length of it because of this check right at the beginning. If I didn't have this check right here, right, we are going to get an error because a rover cannot be cast to a string, right? That won't work. A rover isn't a kind of string, right? Whereas a string is a kind of object, right? They're both kinds of objects, but a rover is not a kind of string. All right, so when we do, let me comment this out, when we specify that the array list is going to contain strings, it does a couple things for us. One is now it prevents us from adding something that is a non-string data type into it, right? So it protects us from making a mistake. And number two, all of this stuff, checking the type and then casting, is if we know that the list, right, that our list structure only contains strings, then this becomes unnecessary. So here we have our string. And let's change that to str. Right, so this identifying the type, right, it's based on the fact that ArrayList can only contain objects. That's point number one. And then number two, once we specify a specific type, it will prevent us from accidentally adding objects of other types into the list. And number three, it saves us the hassle of having to, right, because since the list is no longer generic objects, it saves us the hassle of having to check types and cast before we want to call methods associated with particular types of objects. Okay, and so let me just make sure this works again. All right, and there we are. So that's it for this video, but in the next video, I do want to take a look at, like, what if I do want to put primitive types in here? Like what if I do want to use an array list and have values like 1, 2, 3, or doubles or ints or booleans in it? And so we'll look at that in the next video. But in the meantime, if you have any questions about this video, let me know.